for building a bigger table, participatory approaches to evaluating impact. This is the latest installment in a 6-part data science for social impact learning event series, part of a multi-year initiative at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm Dan Ferris. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Associate Director for Training and Education at the Social Policy Institute at WashU, also known as SPI. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome the founding director of SPI, Nicole Weiss, who is with us today and will offer some opening remarks. Welcome, Nicole.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Dan, for the kind introduction. I'm just so happy to be here with everyone and to join this event. The event series is part of our Data Science for Social Impact initiative, which is a collaboration between the Social Policy Institute, the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance, and data.org. Couldn't ask for a better group of partners. Special thanks to MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for making this event possible, as well as helping to advance the broader field. We appreciate your work and your incredible partnership. In addition, an amazing advisory committee, which included local national leaders, you can see them here in the picture, in both data and social impact, has helped guide this initiative throughout its development. We are truly grateful for their participation and shared commitment. At the Social Policy Institute, our vision is to reduce inequality in social, economic, health, and education outcomes through evidence-informed policy and practice. And we know data is just a big part of that. We are not interested in data for the sake of data, but in thinking about how data can help us promote more equitable outcomes in all of these areas. To that end, the data science for social impact objectives is to create learning and connections around data science and social impact that is specifically geared toward the social sector. I want to thank our amazing speakers for today who are here with us, who will share their vision and expertise on what it means to take a collaborative and participatory approach to working with data. Most importantly, thanks to all of you, our attendees, who are here to help us learn from each other and together. I'm going now to turn it over to Sarah Muhammad, the Associate Director for Equity and Engagement in the St. Louis Regional Data Analysis Alliance, our close collaborator and advisory committee co-convener, to move into our event.
Great. Thanks so much for that intro. So hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Muhammad. And like was said, I am the Associate Director of Engagement and Equity for the St. Louis Regional Data Alliance. So in this role, I also serve as Senior Advisor for the Data Science for Social Impact Initiative and a member of the Advisory Committee. So today's event is the second to last in a series of learning events that DSSI has been putting on. And I just want to take a moment to kind of lift and share that our final event, titled Engaging Community and Mobilizing Data to Advocate for Change, a little bit of a mouthful, but it's totally worth it, will be on October 3rd from 1 to 3 p.m. And you can see the amazing lineup of speakers here who will speak to this topic from a range of different roles and perspectives in the education space. And I'm hoping we'll be seeing you all there. So also, because today's event is about evaluating impact, I'm also going to make a quick plug for our event survey. So we will drop these links in the chat. And if you would be so kind to pull up that link in your browser, that way after the event, later in the day, when you have a moment, you can fill it out. We really do want to hear from you and we want to know how we're doing. So please just take a minute to fill that out and we will take that feedback to heart. So for those of you who may be new to the initiative, this learning event series is based on a framework that was developed over the last 2 years. with input from a wide range of social sector folks, including the advisory committee, as well as feedback from a series of public roundtables, where we had over 200 participants representing over 100 organizations joining the conversation. So as you can see on the slide, this framework includes 6 focus areas, and each month we are holding an event zeroing in on one of these focus areas. So today, that is the advanced equitable processes and outcomes. So what does this mean? So this focus area is all about how social sector organizations use data to evaluate programs and assess what type of impact they're having. So a key part of that process is thinking about who is at the table. So this involves asking questions like, how does your data inform your programs? Who's involved in that process? Thinking about your staff. Do they have different types of data skills involved? And are you engaging diverse stakeholders, including those most impacted by your program, and those who are represented in your data? So are you also asking equity-related questions? And so that when you're impacting or evaluating your impact, you are able to promote equitable outcomes. So these are all questions that we'll be getting into today, and I'm really excited to hear from our speakers about that. So next is, I'm just going to give a quick overview of how today is going to go. So first, we're going to hear from Emilia Parnell from the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. She recently released a book called You Are a Data Person, which is all about the importance of really setting that bigger table within an organization when working with data, and the importance of including lots of different perspectives beyond just those people who we typically think of when we think of data people. So she's going to present a framework called the Data Identity Framework that can help us think about what data skills we have individually and within our organizations, and how we can draw on a range of different kinds of expertise when working with data and evaluating impact. So then we have Nicole Doherty from the Brown School Evaluation Center, and she's going to talk about the importance of identifying and engaging diverse stakeholders across the evaluation lifecycle, which is a personal interest of mine. So excited to hear that. And she will provide some tools and exercises for how to approach that. So finally, we'll hear from 2 presenters from St. Louis social sector, and they're going to talk about how these issues play out in their own work. So Liz Kramer from the Public Design Bureau and Sarah Kennedy from Generate Health. So at the end, we'll open it up to a larger discussion where you'll be invited to share some of your thoughts and insights, strategies with one another. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to our first speaker, Emilia Parnell.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. I can see you, so I'll use you as my example as to whether you can see my screen. Does it look like my pre-slides?
Your screen. Yep.
All right, now, so it looks like a nice, pretty picture of a salad on your screen. And I'm going to start my timer. I think we got a total of 15 minutes for this portion, and then we have like a quick poll to follow that. So I want to just start by saying thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you specifically to Jen Rose for the invitation. And to tell you that this data identity framework is kind of a culmination of a lot of conversations I've had in my particular industry, which is higher education, and specifically student services within higher education. So a lot of different conversations about how colleges and universities should use data, and specifically which people on college campuses should be doing that type of work in their daily activities. And I'm making the case that we all should. So I produced the book. Jen Rose found it and said, what if we have a conversation about how to take this to a larger audience? And maybe this framework is not just exclusively applicable to higher education, but maybe other industries. And I liked where it was going. We had a lot of conversations. And so I'm taking this opportunity to present to probably my first non-higher ed audience primarily. And I'm excited to hear you all's reactions. And I'll tell you now with the spoiler alert that this should be hopefully practical, relatable, and a little bit inspiring, that you would pursue your own individual capacities to use data in your daily work. So I titled the Data Identity Framework and there's a salad connection that we'll get to a little bit later. But to set the stage, I want to make the case that this article that I really say is one of my favorites from Huseman and Gillard, and they make the case that data are available at a lot of different phases to policymakers. And so policymakers could be all of us, whether it's big P policy happening at a federal level, small p within your organization or state. The idea is that if I would take the same set of boxes here, you could almost see them as a continuum that goes from the past through the present and to the future. And I'd say that within any organization, you typically start with some type of question that says, what happened? What's the key question that we can report on? We have some descriptive stats that we might look at. So how many people did this? How many people did that? From there, it usually goes into a question of analysis, like those things that we saw that happened, why did they happen? And we're trying to diagnose possible reasons that led to that. And that's always looking backwards, which is helpful and relevant. It usually moves from there into something along the lines of monitoring, where someone's saying, okay, we know what happened in the past, but what's going on in real time? What types of monitoring of real-time activity should we be doing now? And throughout these first three phases, there are a lot of opportunities to collect data, analyze data, share data, report on data. And it usually then goes into a discussion of the future. So we've seen what happened. We know what we think are reasons why it happened. We know what's going on right now. And based on all of that, what do we think will happen in the future? And so you can get into some really interesting conversations about predictive analyses, forecasting metrics, things like that. If that's not enough, usually those of us who are in decision-making roles are going to say, what do we need to do now? We have all this evidence about what happened, why, what's going on now, what we think will happen, what actions should be taken. And so I like to offer that as a framework to start with, because it leads into a nice analogy of teamwork. And I tried to take this article that I found about what rowing taught this author about high performing teams. And I won't read the whole thing, but it's kind of to say that a key to a fast boat is balance, and that a successful team pulls in perfect balance and with perfect timing. Now, I'm not into rowing, but I think it does make the case that when we're talking about big shifts, whether it be in your industry or my industry or in an organization or all of the above, there's going to be a place where teamwork needs to happen. And so it's not simple as just right hand knows what the left hand is doing, but really, truly, what are my colleagues using in terms of informed approaches to making decisions, and what data are they collecting and analyzing, and how do those decisions connect to mine? So when doing that, there are a lot of opportunities to veer off course, a lot of opportunities to have an imbalance there. And I think that as we continue this fast-paced nature of how we do our work, I think that's a big question. And I would frame it as, how can we maintain balance amid fast-paced changes in our industry? So taking that example and going a little bit farther. And that's where I think the relevance is of a data identity framework. So I'm calling it a 6-component guide to help you find your data related strengths. And I like the example of a salad because I think that salads are better when you have multiple items within. So you could totally have a bowl of just strawberries, but if you were to add some kiwi to it, you add some oranges to it, some lemon slices, maybe it might make a better combination. I say the same thing when you're constructing a team approach to using data. It's okay to have that one person who does the analysis, but you need some other pieces as well. And so I'll reveal those in a minute. I also want to frame this with 2 important assumptions. So every professional, this is a bold statement, I know. I think that every professional, regardless of your role, can find a use for data in your daily work. And I'll use the example within higher education and say, typically someone that says, anybody, Emilia? And I'll say, yes, even those who manage the grounds of a campus. They're probably going to not be doing the same types of data collections as someone who works in the registrar's office or someone in admissions or a faculty member, but they are collecting data every day to inform the decisions. It might be about the amount of fuel that they might need for the month to cover all of the grounds, things like that. My second assumption that I hope we all could agree to is that the most ideal climate for successful data work is one that has open communication, supportive sharing of progress and results, and ongoing collaboration. And it sounds simple, but these 3 things really are a bit of the secret sauce to it. The idea that competition and politics and things like that could really derail any type of progress. So I'd have to say that everybody's seeing their opportunity to contribute and doing so in an environment that is very supportive and proactive with sharing of results that maybe are favorable, but maybe not so favorable, so that the collaboration can happen with a clear understanding that everybody's in this process together. So I promised you a framework, and it has 6 components to it. And working with Jen Rose, I adjusted the title of 2 of them to make them a little bit more relevant to a broader audience, but I think they're all pretty palatable. The first of which is curiosity and inquiry. So it's the ability to formulate and ask clear questions. This idea that you could spend a lot of time and invest a lot of energy and a lot of resources in doing some sophisticated data work, and you get to the end and you get your results and you realize it's not quite what you thought you needed it to be. I would make the case that if you're someone who in the very beginning of conversation says it's sounds like what we really need to know is this. That's a skill set and attribute to actually celebrate, because it can save time, it can help avoid scope creep, and it can actually help make sure that everybody involved is starting from the same general premise about why you're doing what you're doing. Second, research and analysis. I'm pretty sure you expected that to be a part of this, the ability to select an appropriate type of methodology and use it. So whether that be qualitative, quantitative, historical data, you name it, but the idea is that it has to be a research and analysis component. Next is communication and consultation, which is really the ability to clearly discuss findings with any audience, whether that be you determining if it needs to be a memo or a PowerPoint presentation like this, or maybe a conversation, or possibly which audiences to bring in at which time and what type of follow-up is needed. Next, I would say organization context. So let's say you're an organization within the healthcare industry and you're a hospital. Knowing about what current issues are going on and trends within that hospital in the larger healthcare sector, or in that case, higher ed, is really important. So in my example, it would be what's happening at an individual campus or college. In your case, if it's healthcare, what's happening at that hospital. Knowing about current issues within an organization is essential. Next, I would say taking that same example and going maybe 30,000 feet, knowing what's happening in the field. So what's happening in the healthcare industry or the transportation industry or the hospitality industry, whatever industry it is, the idea that you have some knowledge through sessions like this, meeting with other colleagues about current issues and trends, that's really, really critical, because as you start to get down to a local level set of discussions about your own organizational data, someone should be asking, are these types of trends within our organization similar for other organizations that are serving the same mission or in a similar space? Having that industry context helps you better answer that type of question. And then last, strategy and planning, the ability to put it all together. So you have the clear question, you have the analysis to support it, you have the communication plan in place, you have the relevant benchmarking and checking of what's going on in your organization. At some point, you're going to have to select and execute a course of action. And I'm making the case that these 6 things are things that we all have to some degree. And that leads to a couple key principles for the framework. And the first is that each of these things is important. So using that same analogy of a salad, a bowl of tomatoes is good, but if you add cucumber and carrots and lettuce and things like that, now you have a salad. Similarly, these are not in sequential order. So it'd be very tempting to say, well, Emilia, if I don't have all 6, which one can I get by if I just have one? It's probably research and analysis, right? I would say they're all essential and they're not in any particular order. They're not ranked. They're not put in a linear fashion. You need all 6. Similarly, I would say we already use all 6, just maybe not to the same degree. And some of us may have more experience in certain pieces of that than the others. And that's okay. But I think the third principle is that all 6 are necessary for working together in a collaborative fashion. So it's okay that if in your daily work, you don't do quite as much strategy and planning, but you do a whole lot more communication and consultation. It's okay if maybe you're not serving on any national boards to get your industry context, but you do have great understanding of your context of your organization. So I offer that to you to say that this framework, if it seems simple, just 6 core things, then I hope you're still with me. But I knew that if I told you it had 24 components, I might make your eyes glaze over, but it does actually have 24 components. And so each of the 6 has 4 subcomponents. And so I won't read all of these to you, but for example, curiosity and inquiry. What I'm saying here is if you're thinking about not just asking a clear question, but who's impacted by it. And I think this is a place where if you wanted to add an extra lens on racial equity, for example, which particular populations should be best served by the answering of this question? How can the results better address the needs that they have? And so similarly, it's not just exclusively methods with research and analysis. It has to be the computation of the data. It has to be the way that you pull data from multiple sources and an understanding of that. And then similarly with communication and consultation, it's of course knowing your audience. It's of course having the delivery type together, but also knowing when to follow up and how to interpret needs before they actually arise. And so I'm excited about this because it's flexible enough that you could probably say, of the 24 pieces of this framework, you already have some knowledge of many of these things. And so the framework is very asset-based. And I'd say that overall, I've not yet met anybody who would say that they don't have an understanding of some of this and they can actually apply to their daily work. And we have a poll question that's going to be asking you to think about, of these 6 core areas, which of them kind of resonates most with you right now that you might say you have strong ability. So using the same example with the previous slide, if you're thinking about strategy and planning, for example, I don't know anybody who's in a decision-making role that doesn't at some point have to think about not just the monitoring of how things are going, but also the resources needed to actually get the work done and the overall managing of the project and who's involved. And so those 6 components and the 4 subcomponents make up the entire framework. And if you're thinking to yourself, okay, this is actually kind of good. What I'm saying is that when you're getting ready to use data to make a decision, if at some point during that process, nobody has raised the question of, is this still the question that we need to answer? Or how are we going to communicate these results after we're done? Or how does this particular finding or set of analyses allow us to compare our organization to that of other organizations in the same industry? Then I'd say maybe rinse and repeat and take a little bit more time. I think that these 6 components are critical to a thorough approach for making data-informed decisions. So if it resonates with you and you're thinking, okay, I do see a couple of those things that might actually really connect with me really closely today, I would say I want to give you some examples. So in the book, I say that there are 15 combinations of 2, and it'd be pretty lofty to say that you have high level of ability right now in all 6 of those things. And I think I'll give you a perfect example. If your organization context right now is relatively low, you'd say, how would you know that? I'd say, let's say it's me working at WashU. If I've only been there for 1 year, it'd be really hard for me to know about all the different issues and trends within the organization. However, if I've been there 10 years, I'd say my organization context is pretty high. If you were to switch and work for another organization, it would probably go back to a little bit of an early stage, and that's okay. But if at this juncture you have 2 of those 6 things that you think you do exceptionally well, I think there are ways that you can think about the type of persona you might be able to bring to a collaborative effort. So I'll give you 3 examples. If you think that research and analysis and your ability to communicate and consult with others are particularly strong, I'd say you make a really great curator. The ability to explain to others what the issues are, why they're important, and to do that in a fashion where you actually bring more people in, which leads to number 2. If you are naturally able to answer the question of what's the purpose of what we're doing, you know who the audience is, who's impacted and why and how, and you've been there on the, I say, proverbial campus or the organization for a while, I would say that you would make an excellent connector, the person who knows who to invite to the meetings and what their purpose is going to be. Similarly, using the example of higher education, if you are really good at strategy and planning, you just know how to allocate resources and put everything together, and you have the context of what's going on in the organization, in this case, you would be the person who in the meeting says, are we still on our mission? Are we still doing all of this work to the end of what we said we initially wanted to do? And these 3 roles, plus several other combinations of 2, are really good. And I think it's a way to see a very practical approach for how colleagues can work together in this type of fashion. So that's the framework in its kind of entirety. And I want to leave the discussion before the poll with a friendly reminder, in this little cheesy analogy of a winding road, to say that changing course takes time. Probably the number 1 question that I answer from any organization or individual that's doing data related work is, how do we manage the competing demands of so many requests for data? And chances are there's the 24-hour data emergency, and then there's the maybe 2-month, 3-month, 4-month type of emergency. And chances are not everything is going to be an emergency. And so in the book, and also when I talk about the framework, I try to remind colleagues to just take your time with it. It's tempting to rush, but chances are an extra pass at it, an extra set of voices will help the work be more thorough and consistent. So that's where I'll pause. I think I'm right at 15 minutes or so.
Damn.
And we'll go into a poll question. So that's my contact information. But Jen Rose, I'll turn the keys back over to you if you want to operate the poll.
Thank you so much, Emilia. That was great. I really appreciate this framework. And I do want to run a poll based on this. Just 1 second. This is, Dan has pulled up the poll. Which of the following data identities best represent your strengths? And I realize that you just heard this. It was a lot just thrown at you right now. So you might be like, I'm not really sure. But it looks like people are jumping in. I am posting something in the chat here, which is a data identity worksheet that Emilia and I worked on, sort of translating this specifically to the social sector. If you want a cheat sheet for remembering what these areas are, feel free to click on that. And that's just also something you can take away and think about with your organization. So we have all kinds of answers coming in. I'll try not to give any spoilers, but we've got about 57% participating. So we'll give a few minutes for folks to think about it. And yeah, these are all very important. And I really appreciate that point too, because I think many of us been in situations where we realized after an elaborate effort to think about data in some way that maybe we didn't ask the right question at the beginning. And it's really frustrating because you can have some amazing data out there and it still might not be the thing that you really need to know. So
absolutely.
I feel like you should come up with a quiz, like a personality quiz for
So in the
Data
book,
systems.
yeah, it's funny you say that, Sarah. So in the book, there actually is a self-assessment where it kind of asks you to think of some prompting answers to some questions. And it's really just to take the conversation a little bit more down the road of how you might plan to develop some of your skill sets. And the popular question I get is, why is the self-assessment not scored? And I did that intentionally to just start the conversation, because I knew what it would be tempting to do, to say, well, if I score myself and I get a 100 and someone else gets an 80, does that mean I'm more of a data person than someone else? So that's not the premise of it. The purpose of it is for you to take some time, maybe every year or two, and go back and look at your skill sets and where you're positioned in your organization and what you have the opportunities to build out. So I could see someone who maybe started off in a traditional data analyst role, but later on has a broader portfolio and they end up being maybe at a director or VP level. They may do a little bit less of the daily analysis, but they do a lot more work in strategy and planning, or maybe they have to do more broad speaking outside of the organization. They pick up their industry context. So the goal is point in time. It's not intended to be the definitive way of looking at what you are up to right now. It's intended to be something that you would refer to every so often. I would also say it's intended to be something that you would feel comfortable sharing with others and saying, hey, this is where I think I am with my development, and what would you offer to help me advance in some areas where I need some more support. And then, lastly, don't be tempted to measure so closely that it's either you are or you're not. I say we already are doing a lot of this.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just wanted to share the results. And it's interesting that you used industry or sector context as an example, because that's where maybe the least people feel the least is their strength in the room. But we have a pretty even split between curiosity and inquiry and research and analysis. And then, it goes from there, various skills. So it's interesting to think who's in this room and think who's in your room anytime you're working on some kind of a data project. Are there areas where you feel like your team or your organization could develop? There's a question in the chat here. Every institution is focusing on the use of data to inform practice. However, how does one deal with obstructionists that are comfortable in what and how they do what they do?
Yeah,
I
know what you mean. How do you get your colleagues to try something new when they've already been trying for a while? I think it's a both and. I don't know that the pressure to use data, and specifically I'll speak to artificial intelligence and predictive models. That's the way of the future. It's already here now. I think oftentimes it comes up to be one of those things like, well, will artificial intelligence replace human decision making? To that, I would say no. I think we have to always see data as a part of the tool for what we can use to actually make the decisions. But I think we should expect that practitioners will go back to what they see as their daily interactions with the industry, with students, whatever the industry is, the client, the customer, to say that they do have some experience in knowing what to do. However, the obstructionist who says that I don't need any change to what I'm doing at all, I would respond by saying, even those who are very, very good at what they do have to keep pace with the trend of the industry. And so if that's the case, the data to bring to them are instead to say, yes, you're very good at what you're doing, but might you consider that the industry around us is continuing to shift? And to the extent that we need to have new data-informed approaches to doing our work, it's not to say that you lose all of what you previously done really well, but you supplement that with the shifting nature of what it takes to do our work efficiently and manage resources accordingly. So first thing I'd ask them is, what are you most concerned about in change? And I don't know that the obstructionist perspective is that they just don't want to change, but it may be that they're concerned about the impact of that change. So the book is very relational. It's not a book about methods. It's a book about how to collaborate with colleagues. And most of the questions I get are similar to this one. How do I get my colleague to align on something or collaborate in a different way? So yeah, I got a lot of thoughts of it. Peter, if you ever want to chat more, offline, I would enjoy this type of conversation.
Well, thank you so much for this, Emilia. And just as a reminder, there is a link in the chat that has this framework and a sort of worksheet for how you might use it to ask questions within your organization. So thank you so much for that. And if you have more questions for Emilia, feel free to put them in the chat or hold on to them, because we will have other opportunities as we move through the event. So what I wanted to do next is just quickly introduce our next speaker, which is Nicole Doherty from the Brown School Evaluation Center. And she is going to share her insights about engaging stakeholders across the evaluation lifecycle.
Thank you very much, Jen Rose. As mentioned, my name is Nicole Abdocherty, and I'm the director of the Brown School Evaluation Center here at Washington University in St. Louis. And I've been doing research and evaluation for about 20 years in partnership and alongside nonprofits, social service agencies, foundations, philanthropic entities, and academics. But I have to say that one of my most favorite things about being an evaluator is really facilitating stakeholders in designing and implementing meaningful evaluations or data strategies for their programs, initiatives, or change efforts. And in other words, I think it's to help them unleash their inner data person, I think, in a way. So loved a lot of the connections there with a lot of what Emilia was saying was really resonating with me. So this webinar topic is really near and dear to my heart. Our center works with lots of different organizations and partners really to help them continually improve and demonstrate the impacts of the program's policies or change efforts that they're enacting. And I think it's important to kind of highlight at the right, you kind of see our center's guiding values. They include partnership, equity, community, quality, capacity, usability. And one of the key ways I think that we increase the likelihood that we can maybe live out these values is through engaging stakeholders throughout the evaluation or data strategy process. I want you to just take a minute and reflect on this question. What is one hope you have about engaging stakeholders in your evaluation or your data strategies? And I encourage you to type any of your responses into the chat. Building trust. Yes. Thank you. Lots of building trust there. Yeah, engaging them is not just about data, it's about relationship building, which we just heard, and a communication, collaboration. What are some other hopes? Humility, yes, being humble, activating and leveraging other people's expertise, creating that sense of ownership and buy-in. Also just allowing for better informed picture of the data, multiple perspectives contributing to what that data means to them. And also collecting the right data. What does this success look like? And the right data, you might want to get multiple perspectives about what they think might be the right data. Well, I hope by the end of today, you start to actualize some of these hopes and have some processes or some tools that help you think about ways to actualize some of these hopes with engaging stakeholders. So this is how I hope we're going to spend our time together real quickly today. I'm going to start with some discussion about the benefits of engaging stakeholders. You all already started to touch on some of those. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a tool that we use often to just really help us identify stakeholders and primary intended users of an evaluation or data, including what are their roles, what are their motivations, and what are their priorities. And then I'm going to walk through just some of the opportunities for engagement to consider throughout designing and implementing your evaluation or data strategy. So why do we even think it's important to engage stakeholders? And I think this quote sums it up pretty nicely. People support what they helped create. And so you're going to create that buy-in and generate that commitment and a passion for things if people are brought into the table. I shared this graphic with you because it just really depicts how we at the Evaluation Center think about the evaluation lifecycle. And you could replace the word evaluation here with data collection and analysis strategy. Whatever word you use, I think it's important to notice that this process may not always be linear as this graphic might suggest, but essentially we try to design our program policy change effort first and our data collection strategy and evaluation first, and then we implement it, right? So I want you to notice how stakeholder engagement is in the center of this wheel. And that's very intentional, because we really truly believe there are key benefits when you think about ways to engage stakeholders in the planning and design phase of your data strategy or evaluation. And that can include bringing them into describing the program, or focusing in on what questions you want your data to be able to answer, and then determining what are the most appropriate data to be collected to answer those questions, as well as bringing them in the implementation phase, including the collection of data, analyzing and interpreting data, and then moving towards action steps based on the findings. So I think first we just need to ask ourselves, who are the stakeholders for this information? And when I say stakeholders, it's a real jargony word, we all know, but it really is just, who are the key individuals or organizations that are invested in your program, invested in the data, and have a stake in how the results are going to be used. And they can be individuals or organizations that are served or are affected by the program. They may be those that bring expertise in a content area to the table, for example. Maybe there are those that have a position of power, those key decision makers, those key implementers that run the operations of the day-to-day for the program or change effort. It may be also those that are interested in just the particular issue at hand. Also those that are providing resources or funding, and resources could be, human resources, key partners. They essentially are those primary intended users of the data or the findings. So we really strive to take a participatory approach to our evaluation work with our partners and organizations. And so throughout this process, we're trying to identify opportunities to really engage evaluation stakeholders to ensure that buy-in and involvement. And you all already hit on a number of, in your hopes, a number of the key benefits that you're wanting to maybe have by engaging stakeholders. But it obviously is going to increase awareness and commitment to the initiative or the program. You have this great and rich opportunity to bring in new and diverse perspectives. And so maybe you're leveraging multiple data identities by doing that, right? You're increasing the likelihood when you engage stakeholders that you're going to acknowledge the political, the cultural context of the data or the evaluation, and increase the likelihood that both your data and your findings are culturally responsive. And, I think also engaging stakeholders just increases the likelihood for transparency. I know there's often this kind of knee-jerk reaction about, why are you collecting this data? How are you going to use it? And so it reduces that suspicion of fear that sometimes, goes along with data and evaluation. And by doing so, you're going to increase the quality and the depth and the richness of your data. And really doing so, that key interpersonal relationship and collaboration is also increases. And ultimately, you're building capacity for that data identity that we just heard about, right? For all individuals that are engaged. But I think one of the most challenging things that we've experienced, and a lot of the organizations we've worked with, is how do we go about identifying who are the right stakeholders to engage? And to facilitate a somewhat, kind of at least a somewhat systematic process for identifying stakeholders, we have a tool that we use to help guide us. And we will be sharing that in the chat, a little handout and a tool that we use. It consists of a cover page and 2 worksheets. And so the very first step in stakeholder identification, it's really a 3-step process. First is really to brainstorm. You got to get it out of your head. You got to think about all the possible stakeholders that you may want to engage in your data design, analysis, interpretation, and/or communications of the data. And it may include, program staff. It may include organizational leadership, grantees if you're a funding or philanthropic entity. Also, your program beneficiaries or researchers or evaluators with content expertise. Also, community group and leaders, maybe faith leaders, and other kind of policy groups and advocacy groups. And so, Jen Rose, are you able to drop that link into the chat for that? Thank you. Wonderful. And so I encourage you to look at that worksheet that we just shared with you, that link in there. And as I said, it starts by brainstorming your stakeholders. And what this really does is starts to probe you to think more broadly about your potential stakeholders. And this worksheet you can either, as you start to think about a specific program, an initiative, or change effort, or as an organization, whatever entity you're really thinking about, you want to start to think about and check off if these particular stakeholder groups are relevant for your data collection, analysis, and data use. And I think that there's just this process of getting it down on paper pushes us to think a little bit more broadly about the potential audiences that we may want to engage with and communicate data to beyond the usual suspects. And so I'm going to give you an opportunity here to exercise this muscle a little bit. And so I encourage you to independently start to think of a particular program or initiative that you're working with, and either using that page 1 of the worksheet that was just shared with you, or just jotting it down on a piece of paper. Start to think of who are the stakeholder groups that you think are most relevant for engaging in the data and the analysis and communication of those data and findings. And just I'm going to say maybe take 3 or 4 minutes and just jot down who are those stakeholder groups that you think that this is relevant for.
And a quick clarification, Nicole, there are two handouts, 2 sheets. Do you know which one you would like them to be looking at? There's the Stakeholder Identification Guide.
Yes, it's that one.
Yeah, so this is the second link in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Give you about 30 more seconds. All right, how did that feel for folks? I mean, is this something that you've ever even thought about or done before really thinking about your data strategy? I'm curious if this is something that folks have really thought about, just getting on paper and brainstorming. Who are all the folks that I could be working with? You can respond in chat if this is something that you've done or not. I will say that in the real world, if you're able to brainstorm with a small group, that's super beneficial, because you're going to get multiple perspectives about who folks are thinking about as stakeholders, and maybe from their positionality within the organization or their knowledge of other of the initiative or change effort. If you're unable to brainstorm as groups, you could always have a core set of team members or stakeholders complete this brainstorming kind of independently, and then kind of merge all the brainstorming results into a single document. But once you've brainstormed, you have to start to think about each stakeholder group kind of individually, and start to ask or answer some questions about each stakeholder group. Specifically, to start to really think about what are the stakeholders' roles, priorities, and motivations for engaging with data and finding. And so that worksheet 1 You just checked off if you were, brainstorming who might be relevant for your particular initiative or program. You would then be, transferring that list over to this worksheet number 2. And you're going to start to answer questions about each of those stakeholder groups. And the first thing we're going to do is think about, what does the stakeholder group bring to our evaluation or data strategy? Do they bring interest in the given issue, and they want to really help the program or the initiative in reaching its goals? Do they provide diverse perspectives or experiences that can really lift up questions and ideas that reflect all sides of the issue? Are they bringing deep expertise in the area being studied, or that, your initiative, that can really raise questions grounded in extensive research and practice? Are they maybe proponents of the data and its use, and it's going to build buy-in and support throughout the design and implementation? Or they may be in a position of influence and can raise questions relevant to change agents and decision makers? And then ultimately also, are they responsible for the program or the initiative being implemented and can use the data to make improvements? And so we find it helpful, again, just kind of think of these multiple, and they're very likely to have multiple roles. That's okay. But really think about what those roles are and check them off for each of our stakeholder groups, so that we have a kind of a better snapshot of the various roles that different groups bring to the table. Then we want to think about the motivations the stakeholder group might have. And so for each stakeholder group, you would check off which motivations you think are most relevant, including, like, do they have a commitment to the program or change effort? Do they have a personal stake in the data or the findings? Also, is this, like, being involved in the data strategy or the evaluation itself, does it present an opportunity for professional development or capacity building of themselves? Also, if it's part of their job, is one of the potential motivations income? If it's not, you have to maybe potentially think about ways in which to compensate those that contribute. So you then check all the motivations you think apply for each of the stakeholder groups. And now you've at least generated a rather probably lengthy list of potential stakeholders that have an interest in the data and for your program or initiative. So you're going to need to do a little bit of prioritization. And in this prioritizing, phase, it can be really helpful to kind of differentiate the stakeholders by level of investment and stake in the program and the findings. And so there's absolutely no hard and fast rule here about what might make an individual or a group vital, important, or nice to have. But in general, when you're thinking about, is the stakeholder group really vital to the data and the evaluation success and resulting use of the findings? Those those tend to be individuals really responsible for the design, the development, the implementation, and probably the funding. Then you probably might have others that you find, well, we think they're very important, maybe for very practical or political reasons. Individuals, may be a little bit more removed from the day-to-day operations, and maybe they don't have financial control over the data or the program in any way, but they have an important stake in the program and its outcomes. And then we have kind of like the nice to have. It would be really, if given all the time and all the resources, those that have some interest in the data or the evaluation for future planning or decision-making, and have a general interest or right to really know about the results and the data. So you would then mark off on your worksheet where you're really thinking they fall in terms of vital, important, or nice to have. Couple of tips I'm just going to suggest here when you're getting into this prioritization process is you want to keep the prioritization confidential. We don't want to tell somebody you're just nice to have versus important. It really should become, it's really to help guide you in thinking about opportunities. If they're really vital, you're going to want to think of multiple opportunities throughout and more engagement with those individuals potentially. So I think that this is not always assumed, but program beneficiaries, in my opinion, should be considered vital or minimally important. And also, asking input from colleagues in this prioritization process can be very helpful to have a kind of a facilitated discussion about it. So now you at least have kind of a potential tool or a process to get you thinking about stakeholder groups. And so now I want to pivot to talking about potential engagement opportunities for those groups throughout the evaluation process or life cycle. Keeping in mind that there's going to be different individuals and groups of stakeholders that participate in different opportunities, and the tool you just completed can really be referenced in helping you identifying, who you might be engaging and when, based on their motivations and their roles. So we're coming back to our little lovely evaluation life cycle wheel, if you will, and we're going to start here with describing the program or change effort. So we think there's a really rich opportunity to really bring in stakeholders into this process as well. For us, it's often, helping to co-facilitate, a development of a logic model or a theory of change. So really thinking about opportunities to bring in stakeholders into that process, so they can really shed light not only on kind of like what are some of the outcomes that may not otherwise be known, also really rich opportunities and perspectives that they are often able to provide regarding historical information or the contextual factors. And it really results in a more complete and accurate description of the program itself. And also an opportunity for those stakeholders to share insights from previous evaluations or data that's been collected and analyzed and all of that. And also just getting a better understanding of the organization's kind of data literacy or data capacity. Kind of moving along our wheel here, at the start of any evaluation or data strategy, we like to get really clear about what questions are most important and that we want and need data to help to be able to answer. And this is where it's really helpful to bring in stakeholders, because they're all going to have different priorities and different ideas about what kind of information is really important to them. And so for us, that means identifying evaluation questions. Those are just those kind of big picture questions, such as, to what extent maybe did the program reach those we intended to reach? So when identifying what questions are most important for your evaluation or your data strategy, we really think it's important to bring in some stakeholder perspectives here into facilitated discussions about what are their interests and priorities, what questions do they have about the program or initiative. If they're not able to participate in those facilitated discussions, if there's a large brainstorm of all the potential questions we want data to be able to answer, giving them an opportunity to help you prioritize which of those questions are really a priority from where they sit, so that they can really give voice and meaning to what are the highest priority to them currently. And then as you design your evaluation or data strategy, it's helpful to have stakeholders really provide input on what is the evidence that they find credible and accurate to them. That's going to be different for different individuals, but that helps to inform what are some maybe the multiple data sources or indicators we may consider. Also providing very valuable input on what's feasible or reasonable and appropriate data collection strategies for different target populations. Also, we found how helpful it is to bring in stakeholders really in helping to determine the timing of data collection. They're in the know, they're the experts of their, the target population, all of that. And so really can provide very valuable feedback on, this is a horrible time to try to collect data. This is a great time to try to collect data. Also, just bringing in opportunities for stakeholders to develop data collection instruments, whether that's like reviewing and help to contributing to the development of a survey or interview questions or anything of that nature. And also just there's opportunities for the piloting of instruments with stakeholders to ensure language and processes are clear, relevant, and really culturally responsive. So once your kind of approach of like the methods you've identified what methods you're going to use to answer the questions you've identified and prioritized, you're ready to move into data collection. And there are, again, opportunities in this phase to also consider, such as reviewing and providing feedback on recruitment materials. Also, when appropriate, having, stakeholders actually promote data collection activities to potential participants. We found that it's helpful of leveraging the wonderful relationships that many of the stakeholders have to sending maybe introductory emails or reach out to participants of any data collection effort to really leverage that existing relationship. Also, when the challenges within any data collection do occur, bringing in stakeholders to really help you think through brainstorming those challenges and strategies to overcome them. And then also, I will say that traditionally or historically, I think we often think analysis is kind of a purely technical thing left to the analyst behind a desk, crunching numbers or, reading through transcripts and that sort of thing. But I'm a huge advocate here for thinking of opportunities to engage stakeholders in this part of the process as well. One opportunity is really getting input from stakeholders on the analysis plan. Here's the data. This is the kind of analyses we're planning on doing. And it could be simple, descriptive. They don't have to have sophisticated knowledge, but what are the kind of sub-questions they have, sub-analyses that might be helpful to them or important to them, can really help to guide kind of what kind of analyses will be conducted. And also providing input on understanding their preferences when it comes to how are we going to visualize or share out the information. Like if they're like, oh, we love pie charts, or we love, bar charts, that's great. Just getting some ideas of like what kind of their preferences are can help when you get to communicating the actual data. And also, I think that one of the key things is engaging in facilitated discussions about the data and the findings to help really provide alternate explanations and context for the findings. This is really an opportunity to co-interpret the data together. And one of the key ways we do this is through facilitated discussions that we call data parties, or sometimes sense-making parties. And it's a really, really great strategy to engage stakeholders in this kind of analysis and co-interpretation opportunity. In these facilitated discussions, we often present stakeholders with data. It could be in some charts or some data tables. And we ask these sorts of questions. What are these data telling you? How does this align with what you expected? Is there anything kind of surprising or missing from these data and from your perspective? And those sorts of questions to really, again, leverage the expertise, and whether it's context specific, maybe though you see a big dip in a particular year and then be like, oh, no, I can tell you exactly why that happened. Leveraging the additional knowledge of the stakeholders to really co-interpret the data and provide those more authentic data interpretation. And we're going to share a handout, and it includes lots of resources, including a couple of specifically on facilitating data parties, which we absolutely love. So each of your stakeholders also are going to likely be interested in only select results. So it's helpful to, again, go back to that worksheet that you brainstormed, think about their interests and their motivations, and try to understand which of the findings or which opportunities may be most actionable, right? So during this phase where you're developing recommendations based on the finding, bring in stakeholders to help really co-develop those recommendations. And also have facilitated conversations about the ways in which the findings are going to be used and by whom. And they really often have really good ideas of the and by whom and how they're going to be used. And then also just a rich opportunity for them to assist in identifying challenges for implementing any actions that may be identified as next steps. And then lastly, here in the center, throughout this process, you want to think about the ways to communicate data and findings to increase the likelihood of the use of data and findings in planning, improvement, and decision making. So we really like to bring in stakeholders to co-create dissemination plans for communicating data and findings with stakeholders. A dissemination plan just really says, identifying which audiences care about what results, when sharing that information is most helpful, and how, or the mode in which you're going to really share those. Is it a one-pager? Is it a dashboard? Is it a report? Is it a presentation? So really, leveraging their specific knowledge and expertise of identifying the strategies that are most helpful. So, ensuring use and sharing of the lessons learned from the evaluation or your data strategy really helps to refine the program and achieve its potential. So as you finish one evaluation cycle, you're going to probably revisit your evaluation stakeholders list and engagement plan for future evaluation cycles as well. Obviously, fully acknowledge that there are lots of potential, there's lots of considerations when you're thinking about how doing your engagement criteria, including what's your timeline, your budget, are your stakeholders geographically dispersed among a large area? How much do your stakeholders potentially actually know one another? Do I need to build in time for relationship building and that sort of thing? How many how complex is my initiative? So do I have a really large number or a smaller potential number of stakeholders? So all of these things are some helpful to be thinking about. And I'll just say that here in this table, it just outlines 3 strategies: group meetings, one-on-one meetings, and surveys to consider. Which kind of gives you a snapshot of when they might be well-suited, sometimes well-suited, or not well-suited for various situations. So for example, if you have a tight timeline for engagement, virtual meetings may be your better suited strategy due to difficulties in scheduling. And the same may apply if you're really trying to engage stakeholders from dispersed geographic locations, right? So in the end, I think this quote kind of sums it up as to why participatory approach of engaging stakeholders is valuable. Better data, better understanding of the data, more appropriate recommendations, and better uptake of the findings. And so as I mentioned, I'm going to be sharing a handout for you all with some key takeaways and a lot of the resources I mentioned today to be shared out, as well as that stakeholder identification guide and tool. But if you have any other questions, here's my email and feel free to reach out.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you so much, Emilia. What just fantastic presentations, and the combination of the two together, I think, presented some really important frameworks, as well as some tangible resources and takeaways that folks have now at their disposal. And of course, as we've gotten a few messages in the chat, the recording, all of the resources will be combined and sent around after the event as well. I see emoji claps coming through as well. So all of the emoji claps, all of the real claps and applause. Thank you again for the great presentations. We'll take a brief moment here to open up the floor as we have Emilia and Nicole with us, having just gone through some great content, and see what questions folks have related to the presentations or any of the engagement tools that they talked about. You can feel free to put questions in the chat, come off mute, share a question, share a reflection. I know folks spent a couple of minutes on engagement worksheets. If you want to pull or draw from that, all is welcome.
I see a question in the chat. How willing have you found commissioners to allow for longer time to do participatory evaluations and also to budget for it? Good question. Thank you, Dennis.
Yes, we are always an advocate for this. And, I guess we always lead with here are the benefits and here are what we've seen, how more impactful the data that we collect and the data and the interpretation. And, just really advocating for that. Are we going to change it overnight? The minds of folks with it that, are in holding the purse strings? Not necessarily, but I think if we continue to advocate for the benefits of this and demonstrate, here's an example, we've seen a lot of receptiveness with foundations and other organizations of yes, this planning period of really thinking about our stakeholders and different opportunities for engaging them throughout the process is super valuable.
So we have, well, Carol says, my question was answered about identifying and gathering potential challenges during evaluation. Do you have any more thoughts you want to add about that?
Is this specifically, I'm trying to read the rest of it. Oh,
I was just seeing if maybe they wanted to jump off of mute, but
Yeah.
there's no pressure to do so.
okay.
There's also a follow-up question from Dennis. Do you have some practical examples of participatory dissemination of evaluation reports? And then another question about advice on how to recruit the primary intended users to be a part of the process.
Okay, yeah. I'm happy to start with the first question about practical examples of participatory dissemination. And I would just encourage folks to think evaluation reports may not be the right mode or method so really bringing stakeholders in initially to really think about what is the dissemination plan first. And, different stakeholder groups are going to want to know different things. So getting clear about what you think they care most about within the data, and then being like, okay, this board of directors are not going to read a 40-page evaluation report. What would they engage with? Is it a 2 or 3 page brief or a dashboard? So I think that getting really clear about what the dissemination and communication opportunities are is really helpful first. And then, again, we bring in stakeholders to that co-interpretation of the data. So that's another data point. When you have those facilitated discussions and the co-interpretation, there's a lot more buy-in to what's actually the content that's included in there. And they're more likely to be like, I would love to present this alongside of you or the other partners, and whether it's a report or a presentation, because they were part of the process. And the next question, any advice on how to recruit the primary intended users to be a part of the process? I think if you can build in, whether it's compensation or incentives in your budgets to compensate people for their time and expertise, whether it's those primary intended, we do that. We think it's absolutely important to make sure that we're doing that. We also, if it's like we haven't, it may be then formalizing an advisory committee of the data advisory committee that represents the core group of folks that go through, but you're thinking of other opportunities to bring in other folks along the way, and also compensating them for their expertise and their time as well.
Great. So I'm going to pose one more question and ask if Emilia would be so kind to jump in on this one, the last one that came through. And then please don't fret, and sorry to leave everyone on the edges of your seat. We do have 2 more short presentations to get to with social sector snapshots in St. Louis, but then we'll have plenty of time to come back to the questions that we didn't get to this round and additional discussion at the end. But the kind of short question here is talking about a fear of data analysis, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, and that being a significant obstacle. How does one best address this fear?
I love these kinds of questions. It was the purpose of why I wrote the book, because oftentimes the response would be like, "Oh no, it's not my thing. I don't feel comfortable doing it. I'd rather talk to Nicole and ask that person to do it instead." What I would say is maybe a couple pieces of advice. It goes back to those 2 assumptions that I made. One is that the most effective environment for which this type of work can happen is one that is very collaborative and open communication and sharing. So oftentimes those who have a fear is a fear of either, what if I don't know how to actually do the analysis? Or what if I do have someone help me with the analysis and the results are not what I was hoping it would be? I would say the environment for that is to say, that's actually okay. The better thing to do is to not just skirt away from it, but instead say, let's go ahead and unpack it. Let's play this all the way out. Where does your current skill set kind of stop at? And at that point, when you realize what you need more of, my next piece of advice is beyond set the environment. find a partner, make a friend, talk. If it is Nicole or someone who maybe has a specific skill set that you need, start with that question about what you'd like to actually learn. And maybe the journey of it doesn't have to be so fearful if you have a partner to go with you. But I would say my best advice is to do it anyway. And I'd hate to make it be a mandatory type framework, but I think where we're going, we can't afford to not have these types of conversations. Now, I think we all naturally will gravitate toward one preferred method or another, and that's totally okay. Not suggesting that everybody has to know everything, but my two pieces of advice is try to immerse yourself in an environment where it's a little bit of a comfortable space to say, regardless of whether you have some knowledge that needs to be acquired or you have some concern about the results, try to do that type of work in a space where it's actually acceptable that you could unpack what needs to be done. And two, invite a friend to go on the journey with you. It's better than going alone.
Thanks, Emilia, for reflecting on that. What I really appreciate about both your and Nicole's presentations is it's so grounded in connectedness and community. Invite a friend, be with a friend, throw a party, all of the above. So thank you both for those great frameworks and presentations. So again, we'll come back to some of the great questions and reflections folks put in the chat and have some extended Q&A opportunity. But first, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our St. Louis social sector snapshots and speakers who are going to kind of round out the presentation component of our programming today. So first, I'll introduce Sarah Kennedy, who's the data analyst and project manager for Generate Health and can speak on the Flourish Data Hub. Sarah, take it away.
Hello. So I am excited to present to you all the Maternal and Infant Health Data Hub. This project was brainstormed back in October 2019. So it is finally coming to fruition. We had a pandemic in there, which changed everything. But I am going to try to quickly give you all an overview of our process and the data hub. And then my colleague Leah is going to drop all the links in the chat so people can have those. But really how this project started was back, really we got going last summer. And so we had a bunch of practicum students that hosted a variety of community data sessions in order to look at maternal and infant health data, think about it, digest it, really try to give us the story behind the numbers. We want to shift the narrative from individual blame, from mom had bad birth outcomes because she didn't take her medicine or something like that, more towards systematic. And so thinking about mom didn't have her medicine because she couldn't get transportation to the pharmacy. She couldn't, whatever the issue may be. And so we really want to shift the narrative. And so we started out with community data sessions. From there, we took that information and really built it into what I'm about to show you today. And so this first thing that I'm going to show you is the story map. So my colleague, Marisha Frazier, really was the lead on this part of it. So here I'm going to scroll quickly because I don't have that much time, but you all can kind of check this out on your own time. But here we have the story of Black infant and maternal mortality in St. Louis. And so we start with the history of racism and kind of how that has contributed to what we see today. We then move into some videos featuring our community leaders about experiencing racial bias in healthcare. We talk about systematic changes. And then we get into some of the stats and the numbers, looking at the disparities. And then it moves into various strategies that Flourish is putting in place around Black maternal and infant health. So one of the things was community-led investment grants to Grassroots Black-led agencies in St. Louis. I think we had 86% of Black-led organizations that received funding. So these are just 5. There's a whole bunch of others as well. Listen to, support, and center those with lived experience. So we feature Cori Bush and her story. And then we feature Mayor Tashara Jones and her story. And Dr. Amber Johnson and their story. And then Shavannah Spratt and her story. And then we end this with, what can you do? And there's a whole bunch of different links that can connect you to various things to take action right now immediately. So the second piece of this is the data hub. So we took some key indicators around maternal and infant health and some of the ancillary factors. So thinking about social determinants of health and all of that as well. And pulled together all kinds of different sources of data, stories. We have some stats and we have some charts that you can see the trends and the disparity gaps and stuff. So here we feature a map that shows infant mortality in St. Louis. And then you can click on any of these topics to dive further. So I'm going to showcase 2 of them. So the infant and maternal mortality shows this. And so these red boxes at the top are all races. This is the infant mortality rate in St. Louis City and St. Louis County for everyone, and the maternal mortality rate. The reason we combine St. Louis City and County is because this issue is everyone's issue. This issue is not St. Louis City and it's not St. Louis County. We know that people move back and forth and that it's all of our issue. So the red numbers at the top allow comparisons when you scroll down. So these are the rates of Black infant mortality in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. We highlight the disparity gap. We highlighted Black infant mortality in Missouri and the United States, and we put the Healthy People 2030 goal. So you can do all those comparisons just like right here on this page. We also have blurbs of text just explaining the issue further. We have additional resources that are listed with links to the resources. They open in a additional tab so you don't lose your place or anything. This chart right here is a Tableau chart that allows you to either hover over a data point and you'll get more information. You can also turn on and off all these filters and change things around so you can compare and contrast a variety of different things. And then my colleague, Maliha Ahmad, she did all of the infographics for this project. And so each section has an infographic that is formatted on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. It has all the information on it, and it has the different stats and charts. It has quotes and stuff from community members. It has various recommendations that community members asked to put forth. Let's see. And then here is a drop-down menu so you can navigate across the different pages. If you ever want to get back to the page with the map, you can just click on this data page. But I'm going to show you coordinated quality care as my last. And so here you get a blurb, like I said, about why this is important. And then for like Safe Sleep, for example, we have a blurb there, we have additional resources, and then there's these accordions. So when you expand an accordion, It has the definition for that metric. It has the links to the different sources of the data as well, and then a comparison for St. Louis, Missouri, and United States. One thing that we are doing is we are utilizing some of our shared measurement data that we have been collecting for safe sleep, perinatal behavioral health, and we will be starting collaboratively collecting home visitation data. And so we are utilizing this data hub as well as a way to highlight those metrics. So each one of these also has an infographic, so you can see that here. But yeah, that is my quick overview of this data hub.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the walkthrough, for the really powerful storytelling alongside on such a critical issue and area, and uplifting the work that you and colleagues have been doing around it on the Data Hub side. So last but certainly not least by any means or any accounts, we're joined by Liz Kramer, who's principal at the Public Design Bureau, and then she's also the chair of the St. Louis City Community Mobility Committee. So Liz, welcoming you into the space. I'm looking forward to your remarks.
Thanks, Dan. Let me move all your faces around. Okay. Hello, everyone. As Dan said, I'm Liz Kramer, and I'm here to talk about a pilot I was involved in to execute a participatory neighborhood and citywide walk audit that was meant to assess the conditions of walking in St. Louis. As Dan mentioned, I'm currently the chair of the Community Mobility Committee, which is an advisory group to the city of St. Louis on non-automobile transportation issues. And I'm also a principal at Public Design Bureau, which is a human-centered design consulting organization that works with people who are working for the public good. Part of my professional work is facilitating and designing participatory spaces. So this is something that I am particularly excited and interested in. So this project to deal with walk audits started before the Community Mobility Committee was founded in 2019. It grew out of a loose group of advocates that I was connected with who were thinking about transportation and equity. One thing is that when it comes to transportation, we have a lot of data available. There's things like Walk Score, which tells us how nearby amenities are, like parks or grocery stores. We have tons of data from the census about the experiences of people, like where households that have automobile access are, and how inequitable or equitable the distribution of that access is. So for example, we're 5th in racial disparity nationally between no vehicle households, where nearly 20% of Black households in the St. Louis region do not have access to a vehicle compared to nearly 5% of white households. We also know a lot about the negative outcomes of our inequitable transportation system, like where pedestrian crashes are concentrated, that this data from the 2021 TrailNet report shows, and this map from East-West Gateway. This data is particularly horrifying, and I want to acknowledge that just this week we had the 6th fatality this summer of a hit-and-run driver killing a bicyclist or pedestrian in the city of St. Louis. This raises a really big question. What are the conditions and investments that are causing this inequitable set of outcomes that's so disastrous for people's lives? So when we think about pedestrians, one of the inputs that we could think about is access to safe sidewalks, curbs, intersections that are truly connected across an entire community. So as advocates, we want to be able to say, we have these inequitable outcomes, and we need to change the way that we invest in our city in order to change these trends, the outcomes that we're seeing. And unfortunately, right now, most of the improvements that are happening on our sidewalks require either investment from a property owner or a squeaky wheel resident who submits complaints, contacts their alderperson, and generally makes a fuss about the poor conditions, like these examples that I pulled from Twitter of complaints to the Citizen Service Bureau about sidewalk conditions. And as a note, if you are a resident of the city of St. Louis or a visitor here, please do submit your complaints to CSB and they will eventually get addressed. As a comparison, most of the on-street improvements, although not quite all of them, require a traffic study. While the traffic study may not be quite as comprehensive as we might like, it is to some level thinking about a comprehensive neighborhood approach where there's some prioritization and investment about where things are most needed, as opposed to where someone might have happened to complain about it. So we imagined as advocates how powerful it would be to be able to show how the conditions and the quality of sidewalks across the city varied. We wanted to have accurate ground truth data set for the quality of maintenance, the improvements to sidewalks, curbs, and intersections, and to have a citywide map that could help guide policy decisions about the distribution of funds and expose the inequity that people who walk see around our city every day. I imagine that there would be an easy form that would capture the condition of a block of sidewalk when you walk outside, making it quick to aggregate our data and demonstrate what that need is and how we can change what we do. So in the future, we don't have dead-end sidewalks like this one. People in wheelchairs and with strollers can walk safely from place to place, and more people are able to walk in their own neighborhoods. I want to say that walk audits are a critical planning and engineering tool. So part of what we were doing was trying to figure out how, in a participatory way, can we cover the ground that's normally covered by professionals at a relatively high cost without the engagement of the public, to give us some data that we can use for advocacy purposes. And there are a lot of existing models of walk audits, including ones that TrailNet, our local bike ped advocacy organization, regularly leads. For example, the AARP has a really great walk audit tool. I assessed 12 publicly available walk audit models in order to build the tool we ultimately used. But what we were looking for was something that would could be digital to reduce our input time, would balance the human experience with the hard facts on the ground, and was relatively fast to complete the whole segment so that we could do a wide geographic range in a short period of time. So over a couple of years, we built a tool and a protocol for this resident-led, self-guided walk audit that can be entirely completed with a smartphone and a custom designed rope for measuring obstructions and damage, which you can see the early version of it around our necks in this picture. In the summer of 2021, we completed pilot audits in 2 neighborhoods, which were selected because of their ongoing interest in traffic calming and pedestrian improvements. And oh boy, did we learn a lot of things. The pilot audit tool is a Qualtrics survey. It can be easily accessed from any smartphone in order to reduce the need for loud data entry. The pilots took place in the Hyde Park neighborhood and North Point, which are both on the north side of St. Louis. While we invited neighborhood activists and residents to participate in the walk audits, none were able to make it. And I should note that the second audit in North Point was about 106 degrees that day. So they may not have made it because it was unbearably hot. So the audits were completed by volunteers from the Community Mobility Committee who came from across the city. The Hyde Park audit in particular was organized around a community farmers market, so folks from the neighborhood were out and about during the audit. The Hyde Park audit resulted in 23 coded segments with 3 teams auditing, and the North Point audit resulted in 40 coded segments with 2 teams auditing. We made some substantial improvements to the tool between the first and second audit, making it much faster, simplifying the address placement, and eliminating almost all of the pre-work for the organizer. After the audit pilots were completed, the organizers cleaned the data and developed 3 sets of information, assessing conditions, assessing the experience, and assessing the intersections. And that's where we started to run into some challenges. When we started this project, we had 2 amazing interns working with us, one who was executing the project and one who was supporting the mapping and data analysis. While the interns were so helpful, we weren't able to host the maps on a platform we could access long-term. And once our interns departed, it was left to me to brush off map skills that are a decade out of date. And you'll be unsurprised to know that a year and 3 months later, I still have not done that. So in addition to those challenges around skills and capacity to keep the data cleaned and up to date, we had a few other challenges. One big one was that the scale of our efforts and the time we had were wildly out of sync with each other. We could audit all day, every day, and we would not compile the kind of data set we needed to make meaningful comparative distinctions across the city of St. Louis. Without more volunteers, it would be really challenging to have a complete set that could be regularly updated. In addition, because we were working with volunteers, folks have a lot of other things to do. This raised a question about prioritization. Is collecting this data the best use of volunteer time? Would it benefit the transportation system more to activate volunteers in some other way? Would our advocacy be better served by advocating for this data to be collected by some professional groups, such as during neighborhood planning processes, and then made available to the public in a common form? So while the volunteers, I think, actually got a lot out of this, particularly because after 2 years of meeting entirely online, it was an opportunity for us to build relationships with each other. It may not have been worth it for everyone to give up a few hours of their weekend for. But we did learn a lot from this pilot audit. First of all, one of the components was that the experience of the transportation network is really in the details. We normally see the transportation network at that big regional map data scale, but that's not how people experience it. They experience where the curb cut is missing, where there's a gap in the sidewalk, where they're having those dangerous interactions on the ground. So being able to see that data at multiple scales is really critical to understanding the barriers and opportunities to having an accessible and equitable transportation system. Second, we learned that this kind of ground level data is really critical for supporting advocacy. Because those decisions are made at that 10,000 foot scale, we need to be able to back up the kinds of experiences they're having and observing on the ground with those bigger inequities about vehicle access or about crash data. So we need to be able to mash those together in order to understand how do we make policy recommendations. We need this data at different levels, and my hope is that as the CMC continues its work in partnership with other advocates, we'll be able to have more data available, and the quality of that data will improve over time, enabling us to see where there are opportunities for change. So that's a really quick overview about what we've worked on. I'm going to drop into the chat just a couple of links so you can learn more about the CMC, find the walk audit tool if you so desire to use it. I can't promise I will process the data for you, but I will give it to you if you want it. And if you want to send me an email to ask more questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I just want to take a minute to thank all of our presenters. I know that everybody is coming at this topic from a different angle, but everybody is really trying to think about how can we approach data in a more collaborative and participatory manner. And I was just thinking, Liz, with your example, it's interesting where this started not from within an organization, but from an advocacy group. So it's just interesting to think about the different starting points that one can have for this kind of a project. And I'm eager, I've been collecting up everyone's questions, and I'm really eager to get to some Q&A. We have plenty of time for some Q&A and some story sharing of maybe some things other people have tried that are in the room in terms of like being more participatory and collaborative with data. So before I do that really quickly, I am going to do one more shameless plug for our survey, because we have a lot of evaluation folks in the room, and I just have to imagine that you understand that it's really helpful to us to get your feedback. It really does influence, let us know what's working and what we can do better. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat one more time. Right there. And if you just click on it and get it up in your browser, then later it'll be there when you want it. And to do a quick plug once again for our last learning event, which is coming up on October 3rd. And so I'll drop that in the chat. And this chat has lots of meaty stuff in it. People have been dropping lots of resources. So just letting folks know that in our follow-up email after this event, we will share all of these resources and more. We'll give you a link to a page that is just on this event and all the resources that people have shared so that they're all in one place. So really, from here, we really just want to think about how these themes that have been talked about today resonate with your work. What questions do you have for the presenters? I have a bunch queued up that have already been listed in the chat. So I can start the process of kicking that off, but let me just stop share here to do that. And if you're able to, I'll start off with some of the questions that were already thrown in, and then you can also feel free to come off mute if you're so inclined, or continue to use the chat if that is more comfortable for you. One of the things that was mentioned was early on was how do you deal with diverging views from and inputs from different stakeholders? And there were some ideas that were posted in the chat about that. So I did want to mention that if you want to have a look for some of those suggestions. But if anyone here who presented has thoughts on that and wants to give an example of when you might have diverging input from different stakeholders, that I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I can offer a few thoughts or examples. I mean, we definitely think of power dynamics when we're thinking about engaging stakeholders, and are very intentional about how we would arrange stakeholders to provide input and feedback. And so if you're concerned about either specific power dynamics and people not actually engaging because maybe their boss is in the room or something along those lines, then it's the way in which you get that feedback and input is maybe more one-on-one instead of, within a group setting. That's just one consideration. Is the way in which you're engaging, instead of a group setting, doing it individually.
I would add to that and say, I don't think that the challenge, or it's definitely a challenge, but I don't think a problem inherently is that two people have diverging thoughts. I think it's the conflict happens when there needs to be a decision made, and it's a question of whose thought should be prioritized more than the other. Right. I think a lot of times in situations like that, context matters. And I spend most of my time in a space of higher education, so I can use that for example. But I know one of the biggest questions that comes up, for example, is, what does it take for students to succeed? Is the first question. And second, are students actually getting the full experience on our campus? Depending on who you ask, some would say, oh, I talk to students all the time, and they said that they're having a great experience with no challenges. And then you speak to someone else who says, everything is terrible, and we actually need to improve everything. And depending on how you want to make that case, you could certainly gather your own data. So both diverging perspectives, and they come with their own data from two different sources to make the same question have a different answer. The goal is not to have, both of them agree to the point of saying, okay, I was completely wrong, despite my 2 years of experience. I think I have it pretty well captured. I think the goal is to keep the center being that if the intention is to have, for example, all students have a successful experience, and both there is an evidence base of that happening to some degree and an evidence base of maybe that not happening to some degree, there'd be a little bit of a bartering to say, okay, let's expand our scope. And if this is an indication on the negative side that maybe something needs to be addressed, how might we partner to work on that? That works out well, to Nicole's point, if two people are in positionality at a lateral level. It doesn't work out so well when those two perspectives are within the same office and one person reports to the other. And those types of dynamics, I have to think about that a little bit more. It depends on what's at stake and, who has a certain level of autonomy and authority. So my first answer works best when you have a collegial lateral position and no consequence. Back to my earlier point about the most optimal environment is where there's open communication and sharing. It's a high bar, but you just have to have it.
Yeah, thank you all for that. And I didn't know, Paul, if you're around, do you want to ask your question? Because there's a couple of versions of this question floating around in the chat that I think have to do with where in the process are you able to engage and bring people in?
Yeah, and I think the question, thinking a lot in this space, right? Sometimes brought in our center at UMSL as an evaluator, sometimes, and I would say hopefully as early as possible in the process, so we can also inform more participatory program design. So I think that the question is sort of unpacking, if it's just a participatory evaluation, if you're just bringing people in at the end to say, what did you think about this thing you may or may not have wanted? There seems to be sort of a limitation on how deep that can go. And so just wanted to get your thoughts on where and how you would push on that sense of true participation. Even though typically as evaluators, we're well, we come in at a certain point in the process, but there may be a limitation from a participatory approach.
Well, Paul, I think I kind of just want to say I agree. I think the earlier is better, but I don't know that every process piece of the evaluation has to involve you physically being there. There are certain checkpoints along the way. You could do some mini assessments. You could do some other check-in things that gather preliminary data, maybe come in quarterly, something like that. If it's a year-long project, and just talk about what you've been seeing so far. I also think it also kind of shifts the narrative of what previous experiences with evaluation, auditing, assessment might make someone nervous. The idea that it's almost like your own individual performance evaluation, which I had mine today, which is you have one meeting to represent the whole year. So if that one individual opportunity for an evaluator to come in, it could be like, okay, great, because we get to see the whole process in review from start to finish. But it also is really hard to remember those things that happened, earlier in the process. And I think it sets the stage for the expectation that the through line will be evaluation. It doesn't have to be just point at the end. It should be more cyclical in nature. So all that to say, I agree with you.
There is a question in the chat that I will read, and if the person who put it there is still here and wants to elaborate, feel free. How do you deal with the challenge that some may say that rigor may be at risk, or that participants in the evaluation are not representative and upholding power relations? Do you want me to post that in the chat again? I had just pulled these aside, so it's way up in the chat. But, I do think that underneath a lot of these questions is how do you deal with the uneven power relations that come into play anytime you start talking about setting a bigger table.
Yeah, I mean, I'll a thought around just the rigor. I think it's like, well, who is using the data? And I think that really matters. And so whether someone sees it as rigorous or not, it's who's using the data matters. And so how they're going to define rigor and what data is important to them is going to be content specific. And so, these traditional it has to, but I mean, so that's why we value mixed methods, for example, because we're not going to just say only these computational models are the only thing that really matters. No, we want the lived experience, the voice of the participants, and having multiple perspectives and different kinds of methods to get at that. So yeah, I think that, for us, it's really asking about, who's the data for and how are they going to use it? Because, every data is useful for different intents and purposes. So I would just say that it is something that you definitely need to just continue to think about, is who's for, how it's going to be used.
I think one thing I would add about rigor from our experience with the walk audit tool specifically is because that is a tool, it's a process where normally the data is collected by a set of highly professionalized individuals that are expected to act with a level of rigor because of their professional training, that there can be a fair amount of pushback about why should citizens do this? Well, we don't have the money to hire professionals to audit the sidewalks in the city of St. Louis. So the options are we have the data or we don't. There's not really any in between. So one of the things we were thinking about as we were building this tool was what are the ways that we can design the tool in order to make some boundaries that are more, that will kind of force citizens to be more rigorous, which was the split between the conditions and the experience, and really pulling out what is the physical thing in the ground, what's that quantitative assessment that we're doing from what's the experience of this space, so that we're gathering both sets of those data really intentionally. I think that as an advocacy group, there are some power dynamics because we haven't used this data in a way that's meaningful, that we haven't quite played out about what happens when citizens report something and say this is a problem that we're seeing and no one responds. That there are some limits of what data can force us to do as a body that I think that we're still very interested in. And we see that especially with crash data and with hit and run data, we have a ton of data about that. And yet we're not necessarily able to use that to move the people who have the ability to make those moves.
I have to also agree with Liz here. I think oftentimes there's going to be, again, that pattern that I was kind of describing earlier, that you eventually move into a place of not just looking at what happened and what's going on, but at some point, what are we going to do about it? And I think sometimes when the power dynamics show up is when you have the data, and even if you can show the method, it is rigorous, it's been highly vetted, it's validated, all that stuff. Someone's going to say, are we sure that this is the right analysis to inform the decision that we need to make? And I think that's usually where someone's going to say, well, the person who has the most responsibility for this thing, they should be the one to make the decision. But that may not be the person who ran the analysis. And in instances where the analysis, the person who's done that may come to a different conclusion about what needs to be done compared to those who are responsible for managing the resources. Now you have an interesting dynamic at play here. But I think at the least, it's easier to just bow out and say, well, yeah, the method was flawed. It wasn't rigorous enough. When we come back to what I need, then we can do it. But I think what's probably better is that, the reframing of the context. Why do we need to have this data in the first place? Because we need to address this issue. And I think clarity on that, and to some extent that those two competing voices, or at least clear on why you're doing it, then you can move into a space of moving beyond just, was it rigorous enough, into what does this analysis tell us that we need to do. And I agree with Liz.
Appreciate it, very much appreciated. And I'm curious, this is a prompt for not per se the presenters, but just for everyone else in the room who wants to, who may have had similar experiences, just to see if anyone has anything to share. But I'm just curious if there are ways that your organization has attempted to be more participatory or collaborative in how you approach data, if there are any great successes or challenges you can share in terms of moving that as an idea into practice. Because I've heard a lot of people very interested in how to be more collaborative, how to be more participatory, and then running into certain roadblocks as to how it's a challenge. And I do want to open it up to see, not to put you on the spot, Sarah, but if you are interested in saying anything that you may have run up in your process, I'd be interested to hear it.
Yeah. So Flourish has, I think we shifted around 2018 to a community participatory model, in which we have a group of community leaders, and we call them community leaders. They are residents that are from the community. They have lived experience, they have birth experiences, they have just life in the high impact zip codes for infant and maternal mortality. And they are this group that really informs a lot of what Flourish does. They decide our priorities. So they were the ones who said, we need to prioritize social determinants of health, but specifically housing and transportation. They were the ones who we have this chunk of money from Missouri Foundation for Health. How should we spend it? And so they made the investment decisions as to how that money got spent. We set up a community review board. So we had grantees apply to the Flourish initiative, and this community review board reviewed the applications, and they made the decision as to who was getting funding. And so those are kind of some of the things that we put in place kind of as a groundwork to this project. So when we had the community data sessions specifically for this maternal and infant health data hub, we had relationships that we had already built, and trust was already there. And so they came and kind of let us know this is what's happening behind the data. This is really the true story. This is what we want to highlight. And so that's kind of how we went about this. Now, yes, there are challenges. This was not easygoing by any means. And so there's challenges of a pandemic in the middle of all of this. We started 2018, 2 years pandemic, we had to pause a lot of work just to let people process what was going on around them. We hosted meetings, but they literally were just so people could interact with one another. People could support each other with whatever that meant. And really, it was not business as usual. We also have seen a difference in the in-person versus virtual. The in-person, the relationships are so much richer than what we've been able to accomplish virtually. So we've had two cohorts. One was completely in person, like pre-pandemic, and then one was completely virtual. And they're just completely different dynamics as to how those groups function. But yeah, so that's kind of, I don't know, some challenges and successes with community participatory. And I can go down a million rabbit holes, so can all my colleagues. So if you're interested in any of those things, just let us know and we can schedule something separate.
Thanks, Sarah. And does anybody else want to jump in with similar, thoughts on something that you've worked on that's where you've run into challenges or just where things have worked really well? I mean, there's a little bit of both.
I might just offer a quick thought, which is that I spend quite a bit of time talking with professionals who are trying to make data-informed decisions, and oftentimes the questions about what some challenges for them are. You would think the number 1 and 2 reasons would be, well, we just need more people who are data literate, and we need some more professional development and training, or it might be that we need more money to invest in platforms and technology. But frankly, the 3 areas that tend to be the biggest kind of roadblocks or barriers, and I would assume that this would not be the case for anybody on this call, but others would be number 1, truly the politics of it. A couple of the questions that already came up about how do you deal with power dynamics or reporting lines and things like that. But just the politics of, hey, Nicole, if you do this panel thing with me and when we get in that meeting, you support my thing, I'll support your thing later. And I don't like to bring these things up, but honestly, those cultural aspects of working in collaboration with others are sometimes messy. The first of which is things can be political, the side deal, that type of thing. I'd say the second is just truly competition. And again, I don't like to think of it that way, but sometimes competition, not necessarily, let's say who's done better or worse, but truly competition for accolades. And data can be political. You can make data political. And when you're in a space where you're trying to say that your outcomes are, the highest, that you were expecting and hoping that could be the case, the spirit of celebrating successes can sometimes quell this approach of being honest about things that need to be improved. And then the third, I would say, is just straight up denial. The idea that sometimes you see the data clearly, it has a pretty obvious outcome, and you're like, well, I talked to 2 people and they said they didn't agree. And all of a sudden you just don't want to embrace the change that's necessary, which touched on that question earlier. So, those are probably the biggest hurdles. I would love to tell you that it's something related to rigor or methods or, access to data. I mean, of course, we have those challenges, privacy issues, security issues, but those aren't usually the leading ones. It's more relational, colleague to colleague. But, we're working through them, I think, in the industry that I primarily spend time in. But I think the symptoms are pretty consistent for other scenarios as well.
Yeah, data can be political. Data is usually political. Could say always, but I'm just not crazy about that word. It's right up there with never. But yeah, I really appreciate all of that. And just okay, does anybody else have another example they want to share or another question for the panelists? There's something in the chat here. I serve with a community engagement team, and they have their own data analysis team that processes the content in real time. There are open invites to community members and stakeholders. Only a small group is compensated. Not so much a question as a comment, but it is perhaps something that folks would resonate with some folks. Anyone have any comments on that?
I guess I have a comment on that as a person who is working with a lot of volunteers. That one of the things, and I mentioned this in the presentation, is that really thinking about what we are asking folks to do and what they get out of it when we are not able to compensate them. No one who is involved in our committee is compensated, including some of the folks who have full-time jobs. They're doing this like above and beyond. And so I am trying to be very thoughtful about like, what do we ask them to do? How do we evaluate that experience for people beyond the actual evaluation and data collection ourselves? And how do we make sure that those things that we're providing as opportunities that are going to add to our data are like also adding to their interests, their skills, their motivations in the way that can be sustainable and fulfilling for them. So that is in fact one of the reasons why we have not done a walk audit this year, because it was a lot of work and it didn't have the payoff that we had hoped that we would have. And so as we're approaching other kinds of evaluative data in our work, we're trying to be thoughtful about like which things are really the right role for us and how can we be really thoughtful and strategic.
Yeah, the subject of compensation. And this is just a further comment in the chat, but I think the idea of like what, you hear a lot of times people say, well, we invited people, well, we put a call out, how do you truly engage? How do you figure out? And part of it is what prior relationships do you have? This isn't just like, oh, we have a data project or we have an evaluation and now let's reach out to somebody. How are you building those relationships in so that it's not so much that you have to go find people, but that you already are engaged. And of course you do keep expanding that circle as appropriate, but that's really helpful. Sarah's mentioning Flourish provides stipends and gas cards and rideshare and different things like that, which is great. Also about reciprocity. Feel free to jump in if you want to come off mute, but also totally fine if you don't. I realized that we were about at the end of our time. But all of that is, this event, setting a bigger table, is about setting a bigger table, but you can't just set the table, right? You have to get people who want to come to it. So I'm not going to try to go further with that metaphor, but truly how to do more engaging work is the challenge. And across all of these learning events, even though they're all different parts of the question about like, how do we deal with data? How do we assess where we are in relation to data? How do we share data? How do we build equitable infrastructure? All of these kind of keep coming down to this question of, are the right people at the table? How do you get them there? What does that mean? Because without that, how meaningful is the data work that you're really doing? It's sort of like if you can't ask the right question, you can have a beautiful chart, but it's not really that relevant at the end of the day. So just want to take a minute again to thank everyone for being here. And just to close out the event, I'll share one more time. That things you can do. Thank you for being here. Things you can do, take the conversation back to your organization. If it's not going on, there's lots of resources that have been shared and we will share in our follow-up. We would love to hear your thoughts. So again, we've shared the link to the survey. I'll share it again. Our next event, Engaging Community and Mobilizing Data to Advocate for Change, is kind of that next level that has come up, like what Liz was talking about. Do we really, is maybe what we need to be spending more time on is how do we mobilize folks, and it isn't not just about like the data collection, but where is our time best spent? So we have a great panel coming up to talk about that. So just thank you all for being here. I know you have a million demands on your time and things you could be doing with this time, and I just appreciate that you're here, and I'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody wants to stick around, but I will post those links in the chat one more time. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.